Hi, we're back. This is Sally Abella, and we are starting session 2 entitled Water Quality. We have 3 presenters today, and we are going to go straight through their presentations and deal with questions at the same time for all 3 presentations at the end. That's because we're having a lag time between when you type in and send your question and when we receive them. So our first speaker today is Emily Deardorff from the University of Western Washington University, Institute for Watershed Studies. Thank you, Emily.
Hello, my name is Emily Deardorff. I'm currently a master's student at San Diego State University, and I will be presenting to you some work that I did this past year at Western Washington University in the Institute for Watershed Studies. I'll be talking about how we've been exploring the spatial dynamics of algae blooms in Lake Whatcom, Washington, using satellite imagery. So Lake Whatcom is located in Northwest Washington. It's in Bellingham, and it's located on the historical homelands of the Coast Salish people. This is a developed watershed. The watershed is home to about 85,000 residents. It's also a drinking water source, and it provides drinking water for about 95,000 people. In the area, there's a history of logging, which has impacted the watershed. And in 1997, it was placed on the list of impaired water bodies by the EPA due to low DO and high bacteria risk. As you might expect, monitoring has been a very important part of how the city of Bellingham has managed Lake Whatcom. The Institute for Watershed Studies at Western Washington University has monitored this lake for about 30 years, 10 years of that, more recently also monitoring the tributaries that go into the lake. And there have been some really good findings from this. They found that in this lake, primary productivity is generally nutrient limited, and that human impacts have probably increased these nutrient inputs. Another big factor in the lake is that it's susceptible to summer algae blooms, which drive down summer oxygen levels. And so for my study, the goal of this study was to determine whether we could expand the scope of this monitoring by incorporating satellite imagery modeling into the process. So satellite imagery modeling is a feasible monitoring tool because algae-laden water has shown to have a different spectral signature than non-algae-laden water. And you can see that in this image adapted from Victor Klimas 2013 on the left. These known spectral differences are incorporated into band indices that are designed to emphasize the signal of algae in the water. Some examples of these indices you see on the right are NDVI, 2BDA, and SABI. For this type of analysis, there are several options for what satellite imagery to use. We decided to use Landsat 8 imagery because it met our requirements of spatial resolution, temporal scope, and availability. However, MODIS and Sentinel-2 are also commonly used for this sort of study, so if you end up looking at the literature for this, you'll see those around a lot. In order to create a model to predict chlorophyll, we pulled satellite imagery that corresponded to dates where we had in situ water quality data already collected. We then removed imagery with clouds and atmospheric haze and extracted the brightness of the different color bands of the satellite imagery for our 5 different monitoring sample sites. This was done in the cloud-based Google Earth Engine API. We then used linear regression to determine which of the 6 indices predicted chlorophyll most effectively, and then we used the 3 best linear models to study the spatial dynamics of algae in the lake. Along the way, it became apparent that a handful of factors impacted how well we could predict chlorophyll concentration. One was the date difference. We found that it was very important that the satellite imagery was captured no more than a day before or after the in situ water quality data had been taken. Also, the sample depth of the in situ water quality data was important. The satellite imagery models were much more effective at predicting surface level chlorophyll values than chlorophyll concentrations at 5 meters, even when the chlorophyll maximum was at the 5-meter depth. A third factor was atmospheric haze. Chlorophyll A predictions improved when we manually went through the satellite imagery and removed dates with atmospheric haze or wildfire smoke from the training data set, even when these dates may not have been removed by our cloud filtering algorithms. This necessary filtration resulted in a smaller but largely representative data set that we used to then train the prediction models. As you can see here, the data used in the model is certainly less complete than that of the full data set, but it still covered a large amount of the range that we had in our original data set. So in this study, we tested 6 different chlorophyll indices. Anyone who has worked with terrestrial remote sensing will recognize NDVI, which in this case can also be referred to in the literature as normalized difference chlorophyll index and used in aquatic remote sensing. Out of those indices, the 3 that performed the best were the 2BDA, NDVI, and SABI indices. We found that log transforming the y-axis resulted in stronger predictions, and the R-squared values for these predictions were all around 0.7. We then incorporated these band index models into the Google Earth Engine API to analyze the chlorophyll prediction results. Here you can see a user interface tool that I built to play around with these predictions and to compare predictions of the 3 different models and to export the data. We've also brought in a few auxiliary data sets. As you can maybe see, that tributaries are an option, depth is an option, and we've also provided an ability for users to change the color scheme or to export the rasters to mess with in ArcGIS Pro if they would like. This is another tool I built for comparing the outputs of a given model for different dates. It synchronizes the location between all 6 maps, so when you move one to look closer at a spot, it moves the rest of the maps with it. I will be putting the code for these on my GitHub pretty soon, so if you're interested in messing around with them and seeing if they might work for your study site, don't hesitate to reach out or look there in the coming days. While all 3 of the selected indices performed fairly well, as previously mentioned, the NDVI-based model exhibited a predictive contrast without producing the irregularities that we found in the 2BDA model. So you can see this pattern here. This is an example from November 11th, 2017, which is also happens to be a date where we captured an algae bloom in our in-situ water quality sampling. You can see the high levels of contrast for the 2BDA model and lower levels of contrast in the NDVI and SABI model. On the far right, you have the true color model, which is what you would see if you were in an airplane looking down at the lake, which is useful because there we can see that there's a little cloud that hadn't been filtered out by the cloud filtering algorithm, which you see shows up in the 2BDA and the NDVI model results. We also found that particularly shallow parts of the lake ended up having an artificially low predicted value of chlorophyll A concentration. This is likely due to the bottom water reflectance interfering with the brightness signal. So it was just something to keep in mind as we were analyzing this, to take that as a result of the process, not a result of actual things going on in the lake. The utility of this model can be demonstrated by looking at a case study of predicted chlorophyll levels in the late summer. In these maps, higher chlorophyll concentrations are colored green, and lower chlorophyll concentrations are dark blue. Here you can see the northernmost basin, which is the shallowest basin and has the most developed watershed. It's typically where the highest chlorophyll A concentrations are found according to historical monitoring. This pattern is reflected in the model chlorophyll predictions shown here as well. Circled here is a shallow sill between Basin 1 and Basin 2. In this example, this sill has uniformly high chlorophyll predictions throughout the year's study. Other areas in this part of the lake that had high chlorophyll A predictions were the northwestern shorelines in Basin 1, circled in orange here. You can also see that they vary in intensities, with the 2016 example being the highest bloom levels in general. One area that had surprisingly low predicted chlorophyll concentrations was the bay circled here, which is the northernmost bay of Basin 2. These model results are exciting because they are showing us the potential patterns and the dynamics that our previous monitoring efforts sampled at the orange points hadn't previously revealed. Here's another area of the lake, just offshore of the Southern Valley Marina and Golf Course to the south. This was another area where we saw uniformly high predicted chlorophyll A values just offshore. And again, this is pretty cool because up until now, our closest sample site would not have picked up on this pattern, which is a pretty interesting pattern. The final part of this case study that I'll show you is from the southernmost area of the lake, which has been shown to have fairly low chlorophyll concentrations, and that pattern is reflected in the chlorophyll prediction results shown here as well. Circled here is South Bay, a narrow inlet that we were interested to find had very low predicted chlorophyll values. And by contrast, this is an area that's close to the outflow of Brainian Creek, and it tended to have somewhat higher predicted chlorophyll values, which this is an example of a finding that could warrant further analysis pretty easily, since we actually have water quality data sets for that particular creek. And so these results are really encouraging. This analysis technique has widened the scope of our monitoring efforts. And as we refine it further, it will allow us to answer some really interesting questions about Lake Whatcom and how we can manage it. Particularly at times when we might not be monitoring as much, such as when we were unable to monitor during the coronavirus pandemic in the early spring. And also just understanding at a more fine spatial scope where the chlorophyll really is, especially in the shoreline areas that we aren't picking up in our middle of the lake monitoring efforts. In the future, I could see working with a little bit more data collection to see where are we picking up on aquatic macrophytes and where are we picking up on algae blooms. I think that would be very useful. This is also going to lead, hopefully, into a study of more environmental factors such as season, weather, and wind, and how those might impact algae hotspots, as well as more close watershed analysis of areas such as the Brainian Creek watershed that might have higher chlorophyll levels for some reason. And it would also be interesting to look at how these chlorophyll predictions match up with the MODIS chlorophyll predictions that are available also through Google Earth Engine. This work could not have been done without the contributions of a whole lot of people. So I'd like to thank the dedicated people at the Institute for Watershed Studies at Western, the Geology Department, and for the City of Bellingham for making it possible. And I would also definitely like to thank my advisor, Dr. Angela Strecker, for helping me a lot with this project and always being ready to answer some questions. And thank you all for being here and for being my wonderful virtual audience. Please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or comments, or if you'd like to play around with any of my Google Earth Engine scripts, I'd be happy to send them your way. And now I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Emily. How about holding questions for Emily? And we will move on to Curtis DeGasperi of King County Water and Land Resources. Curtis?
Hello. I'll introduce myself. My name is Curtis DeGasperi. I work at King County Water and Land Resource Division. And today I'm going to be revisiting some work that was done by a graduate student at the University of Washington several years ago. She actually looked at Lake Washington and Lake Sammamish, but today I'm going to focus mostly on Lake Sammamish. And basically she looked at the relationships among the timing and duration of thermal stratification and summer hypolimnetic anoxia and phosphorus concentrations. So with that, let's get started. For those of you that aren't familiar with Lake Sammamish or where it's located, it's east of city of Seattle, in King County, actually east of Bellevue, east of its better known counterpart, Lake Washington. It's a relatively large and deep lake, a maximum depth of 32 meters or about 105 feet. And both lakes have a very well documented history of their recovery from eutrophication following wastewater diversion in the 1960s. Lake Washington recovered very quickly, but Lake Sammamish not so quickly. And one of the reasons given for that is that Lake Sammamish becomes anoxic during the summer. Phosphorus accumulates in the hypolimnion, and then following turnover, that phosphorus is redistributed into the water column. And initially, the phosphorus release rate from the sediments didn't change so much, did eventually decline. And this is a fairly well-known phenomenon of the sediment feedback process, delaying the recovery of aquatic systems following wastewater diversion. Another thing I want to point out is the data that we'll be discussing for Lake Sammamish. It comes from this central deep location here, and we'll also touch on some data collected off of Madison Park and Lake Washington. As I said, the bottom waters of Lake Sammamish become anoxic in the summer. You can see that in this color contour plot of dissolved oxygen in Lake Sammamish based on data from 1993 to 2019. In the spring, oxygen concentrations actually become elevated as a result of the spring phytoplankton bloom. Those phytoplankton settle into the bottom waters of Lake Sammamish and decompose, and that decomposition process consumes oxygen. There's also sediment oxygen demand, and so by late summer, oxygen concentrations are essentially zero. And coincident with the decline in dissolved oxygen in the bottom waters of Lake Sammamish, the decomposition of phytoplankton and release of phosphorus from the sediments result in elevated phosphorus concentrations in the bottom waters, reaching high levels in October. And it's believed that the summer hypoxia is likely a natural phenomenon based on sediment coring analysis. It appears that the lake has been mesotrophic for at least the last 150 years. So the primary reason that oxygen levels go down in Lake Sammamish, or in any lake for that matter, in the summertime is because of thermal stratification. And so here you can see a color contour plot of temperature in Lake Sammamish, and basically isothermal in the winter. And then as stratification develops weekly, and the sun, of course, is starting to increase in strength. We get a spring bloom of phytoplankton that increases the oxygen levels. And then as stratification is initiated, we can start to see how oxygen levels begin to decline in the bottom of Lake Sammamish, and as thermal stratification increases, and the oxygen levels continue to decline until we have the fall overturn event, which brings the lake back to more isothermal conditions and reoxygenates the lake. So the graduate student, Tala Woodward, finished her thesis in 2014, and she had this question: is there a relationship between the timing of spring stratification and subsequent summer hypolimnetic oxygen and phosphorus concentrations? And as I mentioned, she looked at that situation in both Lake Washington and Lake Sammamish, and she used data from King County, a 20-year data set collected from 1993 to 2012, and the answer that she concluded that yes, at least in Lake Sammamish, that these relationships did exist, but not in Lake Washington. And like I said, we'll sort of explore, revisit these relationships here with additional data that we've collected since then. So as I mentioned, we have another additional 7 years of data that we can look at, and that includes the snow drought of 2014-2015. If you recall, there was very little snow that winter, more or less normal precipitation, but an extremely or an unusually warm spring, so that in Lake Sammamish, thermal stratification was earlier, and the duration and extent of anoxia was greater in 2015 than any other year since 1993. So the data analysis was based on the same routine profiling data that Tala used from our program. I did a few things differently though, just because it was easier for me to do them that way than probably the way she did them. And I don't know the details of some of her methods, but for example, the timing of stratification onset and duration, I use this Schmidt stability approach with a threshold that's been used before on work that's been done on Lake Washington. I believe Tala used a temperature difference of the surface and bottom waters of the lake. And we used the same timing and onset duration of hypolymnetic anoxia using a threshold of 2 milligrams per liter. And then looked at the average hypolymnetic total phosphorus and found the maximum concentration during the summer between June through October. And those are the metrics that I'll be looking at. So first we can look at the stratification, the thermal stratification onset and duration. So here on the left we have the stratification onset date, range from about mid-March to the end of April. Range of 53 days, and that the trend here is not statistically significant, so no apparent trend. And then the duration of stratification ranged from 203 to 256 days, difference of about 53 days overall. And again, no statistically significant trend in the duration of stratification from the period 1993 to 2019. So what about the relationship between the onset of thermal stratification and anoxia? First we have the onset timing of anoxia versus the onset timing of stratification. And we can see that that's a positive relationship. That's statistically significant. I'll just point out that this is the data point for 2015. And the relationship here in gray is the one that Tala found, so very similar linear regression statistics to her work. And it makes sense that the timing of stratification onset would track well with the timing of the onset of anoxia. And here we're looking at the duration of anoxia and the timing of stratification onset. And in this case, negative relationship, which is what we would expect. As the onset of stratification becomes earlier, the duration of anoxia would be longer. That relationship's not quite statistically significant, and Tala did find a statistically significant relationship, but in general, her linear regression statistics are very similar to the ones that I found. So what about the relationships with hypolymnetic phosphorus? So first we can look at hypolymnetic total phosphorus, the maximum levels in late summer versus onset of stratification, the timing of onset of stratification. And we see a negative relationship. It's not statistically significant, but as we would expect, if stratification sets up earlier, then we end up with higher total phosphorus levels later in the summer. Also point out that Tala's slopes, I'm a little unsure if those are correct. She reported her slopes as micrograms per liter per day, and if you take the slope here of minus 0.005 and log TP, that's roughly microgram per liter per day, which is more consistent with the range of actual phosphorus measurements. The maximum total phosphorus levels here range from 17 to 102 micrograms per liter. So roughly for each day change in the onset of stratification, the regression equation says it'd be about a microgram per liter change in hypolymnetic total phosphorus. Better news is that the relationships with hypolymnetic total phosphorus and anoxia onset and hypolymnetic total phosphorus and versus the duration of anoxia are much more consistent with to all his results except for the slope. They're both statistically significant, and as you'd expect, if Anoxia sets up earlier, then later in the summer we have higher total phosphorus levels, and if the duration of Anoxia is longer, then we will end up with higher total phosphorus levels in the hypoluminian in the late summer. So that's good. Confirm that. So that's all real interesting, right? The lake stratifies earlier, the lake becomes anoxic earlier, the duration of anoxia is longer, phosphorus concentrations are higher. But what does that really mean for the production of phytoplankton in the lake, the kind that would cause problems for human uses of the lake and other issues? And I think maybe not much of an issue, at least for now. There's this concept that phosphorus that's being released into the hypoluminian under anoxic conditions occurs because it's in a complex with iron that is dissolved under anoxic conditions, and then at fall overturn, the iron and phosphorus recombine, precipitate, and settle back down into the sediments, essentially resetting the lake every year to a relatively similar phosphorus concentration before the next spring bloom. And maybe to sort of illustrate that might be the case, plotting up summer, June through September, chlorophyll A concentrations in Lake Sammamish observed from 1993 to 2019, and there have been some ups and downs, basically ranges from about 2 to 6 micrograms per liter, and there was an interesting high value in 2015, but not a high value in 2016 following that elevated phosphorus that accumulated in the bottom waters in 2015 as a result of that early onset of stratification. So at least right now from the data, it doesn't suggest that this phosphorus release phenomenon plays much of a role in determining how much phytoplankton are going to grow, at least in the summertime, in Lake Sammamish the following year. So what about climate change? Well, we're going to need longer data sets. If you recall, we didn't see much of a trend in the onset timing of thermal stratification in Lake Sammamish, and that was with a 27-year-long data set. We look at something like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index, with negative values indicating cool, wet conditions in the region, positive values indicating warm, dry conditions. That has changed since the 1960s from cool, wet, warm, dry, back to cool, wet, and then looks like back into warm, dry conditions again in the last 5-10 years. And those conditions that are reflected in the PDO index, basically climate conditions off our coast that influence our local weather and the conditions in our lakes. You can see that reflected in Lake Washington temperatures, that warming period, a leveling off, and then potentially you can see a little bit of a warming trend here at the end. And then looking at air temperature data from SeaTac International Airport, more distinctly that rising trend in temperature, leveling off, and then a distinct rise in the last decade in air temperatures in the region. And if we just look at the trend in Lake Washington stratification, the onset date of stratification, previous work looking at data through about 2000, found a downward trend in the timing of onset of stratification. So stratification was occurring earlier and earlier since the 1960s, but you can see that that's more or less leveled off since then. And we can look again at the air temperature trends, but look at the annual average air temperatures reported at SeaTac International Airport, and you can see more clearly that increase in temperature to the through the 1980s, leveling off, even maybe a slight downward trend in air temperature, and then now we're looking at a pretty dramatic rise in temperature since about 2010, and that actually appears to influence the maximum thermal stability of Lake Washington quite a bit. There's appears to be a fairly close relationship with annual average air temperature and thermal stability of the lake. So that's something else that might be interesting to look at with respect to changes that are occurring in these lakes. So with that, I'd like to leave the remaining time open for questions. Thank you.
Now we're going to move to Laura Costadone, and she's going to talk to us about...
My name is Laura Costadone.
Good.
And I'm a PhD candidate at State University. Thank you so much for watching my presentation. First of all, I just wanted to apologize because I changed the title of my presentation at the last minute. Today, I will be talking about the impact of alternative urban growth scenarios on the water quality and ecosystem services provided by a major urban lake. So let's start with a little bit of background. So first of all, why should we care about urban lakes? Well, these systems are a hotspot for ecosystem services. Lakes provide a large variety of opportunity for recreation, but also aesthetic benefit. They are also very important for wildlife habitat, both aquatic and terrestrial, but also lakes provide services like helping mitigating the urban heat island, for instance. Most of these ecosystem services and benefit are water quality related. And urban development is a major driver of water quality deterioration. Because urban development means more impervious surfaces. And as we know, the increase in total impervious area can alter the flow of nutrient, pollutant, and runoff. For this study, I focus on nutrient runoff, particularly phosphorus, because high phosphorus level coming from the watershed can impact the lake productivity with negative result on the ecosystem services provided by the lake. And if we think that in the next decade, about 70% of the global population will be living in cities, and this will mean like a higher demand for these ecosystem services, then we can really realize how important it is for us to really understand the impact that urban development can have on this important ecosystem. So when we talk about urban development, we talk about two main patterns of development: urban sprawl or cluster development. Usually, urban development trajectories are developed at a large scale, for instance, across like a big region. And often this approach fails to incorporate the consequences more at the local scale, for instance, on individual ecosystems like lakes. So Bolte and Vash, with the major stakeholders of the Puget Sound region, developed these alternative scenarios to explore plausible options for urban and population growth across the entire Puget Sound region. These scenarios capture trajectories of changes resulting from a range of possible policies and management strategies. So they develop three alternative scenarios of growth. The status quo, which as we can easily imagine, is the continuation of current trends, so business as usual. The managed growth concentrated the growth more around regional growth center, so within the urban growth boundaries. And this resulted in more like a clustered urban development with a limited shoreline development. The unconstrained growth, on the other hand, focused more on growth outside the urban growth areas and resulted more in a urban sprawl type of development. Under these scenarios also, shoreline development was promoted. Also, I just want to mention that under any scenarios, public land was considered for conversion, so only private land was considered. So the main goal of my study was to downscale these scenarios that were developed for the entire Puget Sound region to infer pattern at the watershed level. So I've been looking at the impact that this alternative urban growth development can have on the water quality and ecosystem services provided by Lake Sammamish, with the underlying goal to inform management effort. So the study site, Lake Sammamish, is one of the most important lakes within the Washington state. This lake is surrounded by one of the fastest developing region of the entire United States, the Central Puget Sound. This region is projected to grow by about 2 million people between now and 2050. And the lake is very important because it provides a large variety of services and benefits. It's a very important recreational destination. Is important for cultural values, but also very important for wildlife habitat, particularly salmon. So this is just a brief overview of my methodology. So as I say, I started from these scenarios of land use, land cover change, and I use a model, a nutrient delivery ratio model that was developed by the Natural Capital Project at Stanford. This model is a part of a suite of software that help studying different ecosystem surfaces across the landscape. In this case, I was interested in mapping the amount of phosphorus loading, which means external loading, that can result from these alternative growth scenarios. So the INVEST software provided me a value of loading in terms of kilogram per hectare per year, and I imported this external loading into a mass balance phosphorus model that was developed and calibrated for Lake Sammamish. It's a simple mass balance model that allowed me to assess the impact in terms of water quality response. And then I look at the ecosystem services related to the water quality response. So let's briefly start with the land use, land cover results. So as I say, I started from these scenarios developed across the entire region. So as we can easily imagine, the unconstrained growth of these scenarios across the Puget Sound resulted in more developed land, 62%, compared to the status quo and the managed growth. The status quo is somehow in between the two scenarios. All the development occur at the expenses of the forest, but again, only the private forest was considered for conversion. When I look at the result at the watershed scale, something was really different. The unconstrained growth, very surprisingly, resulted in less developed area and more forest retention compared to the status quo and the managed growth scenarios. The status quo or business as usual was the worst scenario that allocated more development than the other two. And this development occur more in the form of medium and high density developed. So if we look more close to what's going on at the watershed scale, so as I mentioned, the unconstrained growth allocated more growth outside the urban growth areas and also allow more shoreline development. So across the watershed, the Lake Sammamish watershed compared to the Puget Sound, there were less opportunity for growth outside the urban growth areas. And so these resulted in less growth for these scenarios allocated within these urban growth boundaries. And so across the watershed, like more forest was retained. We can see here that the growth was allocated in the southeastern portion of the watershed and some growth within the Issaquah basin. Different is the case of the status quo and the managed growth. We can see that in both scenarios, more like more densely developed areas were developed within the urban growth boundaries, which resulted in more like a cluster development just in the area surrounding the lake. So if we translate this urban development pattern in terms of like total phosphorus, I obtained from the INVEST model that the unconstrained growth, as we can easily imagine, resulted in less total phosphorus compared to the other scenarios. So if we consider the 2006 like baseline, the status quo resulted in an increase in external phosphorus runoff by up to 32%. The managed growth resulted in almost 25% more phosphorus runoff, and the unconstrained growth almost like 2.6% more. So if we translate this in terms of like whole lake total phosphorus, we start from values of total phosphorus ranging around 18 microgram per liter. This is like kind of the baseline situation of Lake Sammamish. The lake is in a mesotrophic state. So if we increase the external loading to the lake, the all lake total phosphorus as a result will increase. And the lake, based on the model, is forecasted to shift toward more like eutrophic condition under any scenarios. Even the best case scenario, which is the unconstrained growth, kind of forecast an increase in total phosphorus by about almost 17%, which means the phosphorus in the lake will increase to almost 22.8 microgram per liter. The status quo, the worst case scenario, 26.8 microgram per liter. I also imagine like 3 scenarios with a higher sediment release rate, because internal loading has always been a big part of the phosphorus budget of the lake, especially in the past. And so I imagine that year after year, more external loading will replenish the phosphorus pool in the sediment that can really contribute to this high internal loading. And we can really see from this result that high sediment release rate can have a really negative impact on the whole lake total phosphorus. So high sediment release rate paired with like a high external loading can increase the lake total phosphorus up to 73%. So if we want to have more like a comprehensive vision of like the historic all lake total phosphorus trend in Lake Sammamish, we can look at this data. So in the past, Lake Sammamish had a bad history of water quality deterioration due to both point and non-point phosphorus sources. In the mid-60s, a larger lakes restoration project was conducted to divert the point sources from the lake. So the lake water quality significantly improved, the phosphorus decreased, and was maintained below the threshold of management of 22 microgram per liter. So as I say earlier, the phosphorus in the lake ranges around 18 microgram per liter. So we look at the different scenarios and we can see that under any scenarios, the phosphorus in the lake will likely increase to values above the management threshold. Also, this translates in higher chlorophyll A, which means like more lake productivity. And these also mean lower Secchi transparency value. The lake has a water transparency goal of 4 meters, which has been maintained in the last decades. The water transparency of the lake ranges around 5 meters. So the model kind of forecasted a reduction in water transparency up to like 2-3 meters under any scenarios. Of course, the scenarios that also included a higher internal loading were the worst. What about management consequences? So these maps are the output I got from the INVEST model. They represent the total phosphorus across the entire watershed for the different scenarios. So the total phosphorus is expressed in terms of like kilogram per pixel per year. So we can easily see that the scenarios like the status quo and the managed growth that illustrated like a more like cluster development within the urban growth areas were the scenarios that resulted in more phosphorus runoff compared to the unconstrained growth, which resulted in less phosphorus runoff. The purple dots are the stormwater facility. So now the stormwater facility are mostly located within the Issaquah basin and at the fringe of the urban growth area in the east side of the watershed. So perhaps in the future we can kind of see that it may be appropriate maybe to increase the number of stormwater facility even within the urban growth area somehow to better management this increased amount of phosphorus runoff. So in conclusion, this study kind of show how urban development can progressively shift the productivity of the lake toward more eutrophic condition. Lake Sammamish beneficiaries are somehow accustomed to a good water quality level, the water quality of around 5 meters. So a reduction in 2-3 meters in water transparency can have really negative consequences in terms of recreational and aesthetic benefit, without even mention the potential impact on wildlife habitat, because more eutrophic system can be really detrimental for the wildlife habitat. So this studies is particularly relevant because show the potential impact that alternative urban development can have on the ecosystem services provided by a major urban lake, and also kind of show the importance of conducting ecosystem service trade-off analysis across multiple spatial scales, for instance, the regional versus the local scale. For instance, the scenarios that allow for more shoreline development, the unconstrained growth, may be resulted in negative impact for the ecosystem services at the coastal area. But if we look at the impact on lakes, so, more like a local scale, that was not bad. Actually, was the best case scenarios. So the lakes should be really considered into the analysis of this potential trade-off among different ecosystem services across the landscape. On the top of everything, I'm just going to briefly mention climate change can eventually make things worse because especially for this area, climate change forecasts an increase in precipitation level, especially during the winter, which can increase the runoff of the lake, runoff of total phosphorus in the lake, which over time can contribute in replenish this sediment pool of phosphorus that can really drive up the productivity of the lake during the summer. So thank you so much for watching my presentation. I really hope to see you live at the Q&A to discuss my project and address your question. And if you have more comment, please feel free to reach out anytime. My email is laura27@pdx.edu. Thank you so much, and I will see you later. Bye.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to all three presenters today. We do have some questions, which I will read. So the first one is for Emily. Emily, can you talk about wind velocity, direction, and fetch in relation to your identified algae hotspots in Lake Whatcom? We find a good relationship for this at Green Lake in Seattle. You need to unmute. Great.
Yeah, that's a really astute question, because that is one of the reasons we wanted to get this sort of spatial data. We haven't actually looked yet at the wind direction and fetch on these algae hotspots. So that's kind of where this project is going. But what we'll be doing is, or what we would like to do is look at different wind events and then pull up the algae predictions for those dates in that area. It'll take a little bit of data wrangling, but nothing we can't do. And then look to see to what extent those wind directions are affecting where the algae is. And then asking, is this always the case, or is this a factor creating variance in our results?
Okay. Okay, another question for Emily. Are you able to distinguish algae from macrophytes or other things that might show similar coloring? For example, the reflectivity of the lake bed in shallow water.
Yeah, so we haven't gone through and parsed between the aquatic macrophytes and the algae, and I think that's a pretty important thing that's going to require a little bit of in situ data validation. And that's one thing that would take this from a technique that gives us an idea of where problem areas might be to a technique that can tell us quantifiable, reliable hotspot values. So for macrophytes, we haven't looked at that yet, but we've talked about it. For the lake bed, it actually shows a very different signal. When you can see the bottom, it actually shows up. In one of my slides, I showed the shoreline interference. It actually shows a very small, it shows like a zero algae prediction, or zero chlorophyll prediction right in the areas where you're getting the bottom water reflectance. So that's pretty obvious, because we know we wouldn't see such a hard line from 3 or 4 to 0. So we can tell that that is the shoreline reflectance.
Okay. And question for Curtis. Curtis, could the chlorophyll peak in 2015 be due to low surface phosphorus loading resulting from the low snow melt and inflow rates? I wonder if that's backwards.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good explanation. I mean, I guess the other thing I'll point to is the increased stability in 2015. The thermal stability was kind of off the charts. So there's a stratification during the summer. So one possibility is that it makes it more difficult for the algae to settle through the thermocline into the hypolimnion. It also, I guess, that mixing is going to be perhaps, it's going to be a little better defined in the surface layer. So keeps the algae in the light and happy, I guess. But it may have something to do with loading in the spring, or some feature of that unusual warm spring that we had that translated into potentially more. So you have the spring bloom, it basically consumes the nutrients in the lake, and then whatever the diatoms don't consume kind of gets translated into the epilimnion, and that's the nutrients that the algae sort of in zooplankton cycle on through the summer. So maybe they got an extra boost at the end of the spring because of the quick onset of strong stratification in the spring. That's another thought I've had.
Okay, another question for Curtis. Years ago, in comparing Lake Washington and Lake Sammamish, differences were attributed to the difference in basin shape. Lake Washington being more U-shaped, or flattened W-shaped, and Lake Sammamish being V-shaped. As a result, the epilimnetic production was more concentrated in Lake Sammamish hypolimnion. Does that still hold up?
Yes, I've never heard that explanation. And so the one that the explanation that's given in Gene Welch's EPA report from 1977, and I believe it's appeared probably in something that Edmondson's written, is that it's not so much the shape, it's the apomnetic to hypomnetic volume ratio. So they have a very similar shape, but their Lake Sammamish is much shallower, but they have the same epilumnetic thickness. So, and this roughly amount of phosphorus aerial loading, and the same amount of phytoplankton production. So that same amount of phytoplankton production gets decomposed in a much smaller volume in Lake Sammamish than Washington. So the oxygen levels in Lake Washington go down to maybe 5, 6, 7 milligrams in the summer, but it never becomes anoxic, just because there's so much more oxygen in the hypolimnion that the bacteria can work on.
Right. From what I recall, in the 60s, Lake Washington oxygen levels in the deep hypolimnion did approach 2, but after sewage diversion, that recovered quite quickly.
Right.
Okay, another quick one. Is the data from Lake Washington about thermal stability published?
The initial trends were published, but there's nothing been published since the papers that Monica Winder and George R. Panditsis published back in mid-2000s.
Right. Okay. Now, a question for Laura. There was probably, wait a minute. I'm having a problem here. This would take just a second. Is there a risk that someone who quickly glances at the study might use it to advocate for uncontrolled growth based on, let's see. If so, how do you manage that in your communications in sharing your results with the public?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And there has been like few studies that have been looking at the difference between the urban sprawl and urban density development and the impact that these have on water quality. Some of the studies were conducted actually in Puget Sound by Marina Alberti. And, we all think like sprawl development is bad for, some of the ecosystem services. But some studies show that actually can be better than more like a density development, especially around the lake, the urban growth area. If we look at the map, is like a buffer zone around Lake Sammamish. And if we put like a more concentrated growth within those areas, then the result in terms of like total phosphorus and then, lake water quality response is obvious. So I know this is kind of like, I want to say a political question, and it's tricky when we communicate the science result, because I don't want to say like, yes, let's do like urban sprawl. Maybe the study was more like toward, we should really carefully consider decision made like a big regional scale toward like a single habitat. Because something that can be detrimental, for instance, for like the coastal system, if we put more like pressure on that area, we can be better for the lake if we put like less growth around that within that watershed. So I think that's a very tricky question to at the end like to communicate, because we don't want to say yes, go for urban sprawl growth, but we just want to make sure we carefully consider all the impact in a large scale of ecosystem services.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. There's a final quick question for Laura. Have you considered evaluating a scenario where clustered and controlled development was focused away from the lake? I think that might be a zoning question, but
yeah, that's a good question, and I would like to do it. The problem is the limitation of data available, because to run this model, you really need to have this map, this raster map with the scenarios. And the only data I was able to find is this study that was part of this Envision in Puget Sound. It was conducted like a few years ago, and those are the only raster data available to run this kind of software.
Mm-hmm.
So Probably there is a way in GIS to kind of create my own map, and that would be really good. But even if we allocate more growth, but is within the watershed, that runoff can still reach the lake. And at the end, it kind of comes down to the amount of forest that is retained, because, in terms of like phosphorus runoff, the forest has a really the largest capability of really retaining phosphorus.
Thank you. Well, that's going to conclude our question and answer session. If we didn't get to your question, please make sure it got sent to info@walpa.org, and we'll see about getting a response to you. So right now we have a 10-minute break. We will reconvene at 11:30, and that will be for the WALPA business meeting. Following that, we'll have a lunch break, and we will take up our afternoon sessions beginning at 1 o'clock. So thank you so much for attending. I hope you'll come to the WALPA business meeting and find out what we're up to.